Hello, and welcome to my presentation on asynchronous world language instruction and its effects on student confidence and motivation. My name is Kylie Handyside, and this year marks my 7th in education and at my current position in a rural public high school in mid-Missouri. This was an action research project for my Capstone course, Teacher Education 6910, under the supervision of Dr. O'Brien. My primary research question for this project was, how does asynchronous world language instruction influence students' confidence and motivation in producing target language output? So, in other words, how confident and motivated did they feel to both speak and write French in my classroom? In seeking to address that question, I also wanted to find out if the same instructional strategies that are used in the classroom can be achieved in a virtual format, how they would need to be modified, and if they would still be as effective. There were several purposes for my study, the primary being to maintain as many in person sections of French as possible at our school this year. I had been approached by administration at the end of last school year, so at the end of the 2021 school year, about the possibility of offering a section of an asynchronous virtual section of both French 1 and French 2 to our students this year. That would have taken one in person section out of my schedule this year. The reason for wanting to do this on our administration's behalf was to increase the college readiness of it for as many students as possible in our building. There are many universities and colleges out there that want to see students have 2 consecutive years of world language on their transcripts. There sometimes that's a requirement for admission into their institution. After referring back to some baseline data, however, such as student grades and the retention rate for asynchronous virtual learners in our building, I didn't feel that that was either beneficial to the students or to our world language program as a whole. I've worked really hard in the past 7 years to retain the number of students in our upper level sections, so the number of students who are choosing to continue learning French beyond those 2 years recommended by colleges and universities. My first year of teaching in our building, I only had French 1 and French 2. By my second year, I had a small section of French 3 with just 5 students, and then by the 2019-2020 school year, I had 27 students enrolled in my French 3 course. Part of the reason that I feel I was successful in building our program was by increasing my students' level of confidence and motivation in producing the target language. I attended several conferences on grit and growth mindset for world language learners, and I also introduced the syllabi literacy to our program and to our building several years ago. In case you're not familiar with the syllabi literacy, it is an achievement that's displayed on both students' transcripts and their high school diploma, and it indicates that they're proficient or biliterate in both English and a second language. In order to qualify for this achievement, which can potentially earn them college credit and is also attractive to various employers, students not only have to complete a cultural competency project, but they also have to take a skills-based assessment that demonstrates their proficiency across all 4 domains of the language. So reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So in order to prepare my students for the syllabi literacy, one of my main goals is to increase their output and obviously their level of proficiency. To put into further context the effects of asynchronous virtual learning on my retention rate, I want to share some of my baseline data. So, after the 2019-2020 school year, the one that was abruptly ended by COVID-19 in March, I had an 83% retention rate of French 1s, meaning that the large majority of them did go on to study French 2. This was a little bit higher than previous years, but not significantly. And like I said, I had been working hard in previous years to build my program and retention rate. After the 2020-21 school year, however, the first year where we have started to offer asynchronous virtual sections of French 1 and French 2, I had a less than 50% retention rate, and this number does include both in person and asynchronous virtual learners. If we look at the virtual learners specifically, fewer than 1 in 4 went on to study French too. In preparing for my action research project, I read numerous articles and literature, particularly that regarding recent trends in world language instruction. No longer is the focus on accuracy, but rather on competency. So, what students can do with the language rather than what gaps exist in their vocabulary and in their grammar. Authenticity is also very important both to language learning and assessment. As instructors, we should be facilitating the use and exposure to authentic target language resources and allowing our students to hear native speakers. Part of that authenticity is also allowing for a negotiation of meaning. According to linguist Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis, students should be hearing language that's just beyond their level of comprehension in order to increase their level of proficiency. Also important is allowing our students to participate in goal setting. And then finally, although technology can be very helpful, it can also increase second language learners' affective filter. In other words, it can make them more anxious and less confident in their ability to produce the target language. I found this quote from Eaton in 2010 particularly relevant. The focus is no longer on grammar, memorization, and learning from rote, but rather using language and cultural knowledge as a means to connect with others from around the globe. The setting in which the study took place is a rural public high school in mid Missouri. We have around 950 students, and 44% qualify for free and reduced lunch. According to the US Census, 77.8% of our city's population has consistent access to the internet via a subscription. I felt this important to note since my study has to do with asynchronous virtual learning and teaching. 95% of our city's population is English speaking. This is relevant because my class is often the first exposure that students have to a foreign language or culture. And then 16% of our city's residents hold a bachelor's degree. This is important because many of my students are first time college attendees and report their primary motivation for taking French is to gain admission into the college or university of their choice. Participants in my study included 20 current second year French students, 5 of whom were virtual learners last year for French 1, and 15 of whom were in person. One of these students did switch to in person learning at semester. 8 of these students are male and 12 are female. All are Caucasian native English speakers, and 9 of these students experienced a period of virtual learning last year while in quarantine. Other participants included 5 former first year French students, 4 of whom did not meet the prerequisite to continue on to French 2, and 1 of whom did earn an A but chose not to continue her world language learning. All of these former first year students are Caucasian female native English speakers. Because our district is not offering a virtual world language learning option this year, I did have to simulate this experience, and I did so over the course of 2.5 weeks, or one thematic unit over clothing. I have 2 sections of French 2, and one section acted as the in person traditional learners. They completed their activities and assessments in the classroom synchronously, and the other section were my virtual learners. I put this in quotations because they were technically in the building, but they all reported to separate classrooms during that hour, completing their activities independently and communicating with me via Canvas and email. All students in this study did turn in a consent form in order to participate. Other than simulating that virtual learning experience, A primary intervention of mine was the use of a learning management system or an LMS. In our district, we use Canvas. This is our fourth year using Canvas. I used it both with my in person learners and my comparative virtual group. Of course, I didn't have to use it as often with my in person learners. With my virtual students, I used it to communicate with them, to deliver lessons, organize resources, collect their work, assign grades, and provide feedback. Other interventions included the integration of certain apps and tools on Canvas. One was Flipgrid. I used Flipgrid to get students practicing in a presentational and interpersonal mode of the target language. They were able to record videos of themselves speaking and then respond to various classmates. And then Edpuzzle, I used for comprehensible input or for listening or interpretive skills. I had my students listen to audio of native French speakers and then embedded a series of multiple choice questions to assess their level of comprehension. And then finally, virtual gamification. I found a lot of success in my classroom using games to get students speaking and reviewing concepts of vocabulary or grammar. So for my virtual students, I created a choice board of games and activities for them to complete throughout the unit. Some of these games were on Gimkit, some were on Kahoot or Quizlet. They were able to decide what concepts they needed to review or which platforms they preferred. To ensure the highest level of validity in my findings, my research features a series of both qualitative and quantitative data. This data was gathered through group interviews, observations, and Likert scale surveys. First, I conducted focus group interviews in order to determine what instructional strategies worked last year in an asynchronous virtual format and what would need to be modified to best meet the needs of my learners. And it was both an interview and survey because with my current in person second year French students, I recorded the interview, the group interview, transcribed it, went through, and identified reoccurring themes. With the students who I no longer see, those students who did not go on to study French this year, I asked them these questions in a Google Forms survey. I decoded it the same way, reading through their responses and then identifying reoccurring themes. The questions that were asked are here on the screen. How would you describe your overall experience learning French during the 2020-21 school year? I also asked them to describe their confidence and motivation levels when speaking and writing in French last year. And then finally, I wanted to know what factors they felt positively or negatively influenced their confidence and motivation to produce French last year. Here are some responses from students who participated in French 1 via an asynchronous virtual format. There were a couple major themes that I was able to pick out from their responses, the first being a lack of authenticity. They didn't feel that they had a community to practice the language with, and therefore they didn't feel that they were properly acquiring the language. It was mentioned several times that pronunciation was an issue. Students felt very unconfident in their ability to pronounce the language. And then there was the technological filter. Even when feeling motivated, technology sometimes presented an obstacle in staying motivated. For example, one student mentioned their use of Google Translate. They knew that they could do their work the last minute. They didn't feel motivated to acquire the language or to increase their level of proficiency because they could rely on such tools. And then someone else mentioned that even when they felt motivated, obstacles with technology or issues that they were experiencing decreased their level of motivation. The responses that I received from my in person learners provided quite the contrast. The classroom environment and specific activities that we did were cited several times. Students clearly felt a stronger sense of community learning in person. They felt engaged and had fun. They were motivated to increase their level of proficiency and to practice using the French language with their peers. They also felt that I was able to better assess their progress or level of proficiency when learning in person. I designed and curated a series of 8 different activities for my students to complete throughout the course of the unit. The activities were pretty parallel for both my in person and virtual learners, although I did use the feedback they provided in the focus group interviews and surveys to modify some of the activities. For example, the game choice board. We weren't able to complete some of the communicative activities that we do in person in a virtual format, so instead I allowed them to choose different vocabulary and grammar concepts that they felt they needed to review and do that either on Gimkit, Kahoot, or Quizlet. Students also completed 2 different worksheets, a workbook page over the vocabulary, and then a translation page to practice demonstrative adjectives and to apply that grammar concept. For the virtual students, they completed this on Canvas via a fillable PDF. There were 2 Edpuzzle listening activities in which students listened to native French speakers and then responded to embedded multiple choice questions. There were 2 Flipgrid assignments in which students recorded themselves speaking and then practiced their interpersonal skills by responding to 2 classmates. There was also an immersion shopping experience on the Galerie Lafayette department store website, a popular French department store, and students had to navigate this website completely in the target language, shopping for various indicated scenarios, such as a school dance, shopping for camping, for the first day of school, etc. I had originally intended to collect data on this experience to triangulate their level of motivation, the data on their level of motivation. However, that didn't quite go as planned. So I wanted to tally the number of questions that were asked regarding the French language, the French culture, and then technology. I did lose count on the number of questions that were asked to me by my in class students. However, I only received 4 questions from my virtual learners, and 2 of those were from the same person. And all 4 questions had to do with technology issues. None of those questions had to do with the French language or culture. At the end of this unit, both groups of students completed 2 different performance based assessments. The first was a presentational writing assessment, where students needed to be able to identify articles of clothing in French, as well as provide details like clothing fabric and give opinions about fashion choices. Both the in person learners and the comparative virtual learning group were able to access the rubric with the learning targets and their proficiency goal starting day 1 of the unit, so they could prepare ahead of time if needed. After they finished their presentational writing, students logged on to Canvas and then completed a Likert scale survey where they responded to questions about their confidence, their writing confidence. So I wanted to know how confident they felt about the comprehensibility of their writing. Would they be understood by a native speaker? How confident they felt about their vocabulary and grammar. So did they know enough words or use enough words to convey their point? Would grammatical errors interfere with their intended meaning? And then I wanted to know how confident they felt about the organization of their writing. Was it presented in a way that makes sense? They rated themselves from a 1, not confident at all, to a 5, very confident. Here we can see that my virtual learners were much less confident in their writing in every aspect: comprehensibility, vocabulary usage, grammatical accuracy, and the organization of their own writing. The second performance based assessment that my students completed was in the interpersonal mode. I interviewed them about their clothing and their own fashion choices. Once they were finished with that assessment, they also completed a Likert scale survey on their confidence levels. I asked them about their pronunciation, if they felt it would be understood by a native French speaker, as well as the vocabulary and grammar usage once again, and then how confident they felt about their overall fluency. Did they need to pause a lot? Was there a lot of hesitation in their speech? Once again, they rated themselves from a 1, not confident at all, to a 5, very confident. Once again, my virtual learners were less confident in each aspect: pronunciation, vocabulary usage, grammatical accuracy, and overall fluency. Interestingly, my in person learners felt more confident speaking than they did writing, while my virtual learners felt more confident writing than they did speaking. Because my inquiry is focused on students' perceived levels of confidence and motivation when it comes to producing French, I chose not to include data on their actual performances or scoring of the performances. Instead, I just made some observations. And what I noticed was there was an increased use of English in my virtual learners' writing, while only 1 out of 10 of my in person learners incorporated English to their writing. 4 out of 10 of my virtual learners did so. Over on the right, I've highlighted the English in one of the samples from my virtual learners. And then at the top there, you'll see that she wrote, "Don't know what I'm doing." So she clearly felt it important to communicate to me her lack of confidence in completing the task at hand. When it came to producing French verbally, there was once again an increased use of English among my virtual learners. 6 out of 10 of them incorporated English into their oral performance, while not a single one of my in person learners did so. There was also an increased amount of hesitation or pausing in my virtual learners' speech. And then, interestingly, my virtual learners often had to translate back to me what I had asked before they felt comfortable responding. So either they didn't feel confident in their ability to interpret what I had said, or they needed to buy themselves some time before they felt confident responding. Once we wrapped up the entire unit, I asked my students to complete a survey on their motivation to learn and produce French. They were asked to rate themselves on their motivation to produce French in class as well as outside of class, and also on their motivation to continue learning French under the circumstances or environment of this previous unit. They rated themselves from 1, very unmotivated, to a 5, very motivated. Results indicate that my virtual learners were much less motivated to produce French, either in writing or orally, when compared to their in person peers. Regardless of the learning environment, however, students were more motivated to produce French in class or for academic purposes. This probably isn't atypical for any content area, but it does tell me that I have some work to do when it comes to increasing my students' global awareness, and they're wanting to use the language for their own personal enjoyment. They're wanting to connect with others outside of their own language and outside of their own culture. When it came to my students' motivation to continue learning and producing French, the majority of my virtual learners indicated feeling unmotivated under the circumstances and environment of the previous unit. Only 30% still felt motivated to continue their French studies. This is dramatically lower than the almost 67% of my in person learners who indicated feeling motivated to continue studying French. Further evidence of the negative effects that asynchronous virtual learning had on my students' motivation can be seen in the completion of their work. As a whole, my in person learners turned in 79% of the work assigned to them. Comparing that to my asynchronous virtual learners, who only turned in 45% of the work assigned to them, we see a 34% difference. That's huge. Here are some of the comments that I heard from my virtual learners when they returned back to the classroom environment. There were several comments made about technology. So, once again, clearly there's a theme here of technology increasing their effective filter, making them feel less confident in their ability to acquire and produce the language, and also that lack of authenticity. It's not as engaging when they don't have someone to use the language with. And one particular quote stood out to me. Someone said there's not a lot of motivation for them right now because they only need to learn and produce French for this class. So, once again, I've got some work to do when it comes to increasing my students' global awareness and helping them set goals and how they can use the language and how they can connect with other cultures in their personal lives. In conclusion, asynchronous virtual instruction has had a negative impact on my students' performance, on the negative influence on their target language output, and this can be partially attributed to decreased confidence and decreased motivation. Not only were my virtual learners less confident in their ability to produce the target language, but they were less likely to ask for help and more willing to rely on a translator. They were less likely to participate in curricular activities and less likely to complete their work as compared to the in person group. Finally, my in person language learning yields a higher motivation and thus a higher student retention rate. Although my action research project did shed a negative light on the asynchronous instruction of a world language and its effects on student confidence and motivation, it did inspire some future research and goals within my own practice. For one, I would love to try flipped learning. I think that I could make the most of Canvas and technology to free up class time for authentic application of the language. If I post vocabulary and grammar lessons prior to or post a lesson, there's more time to administer comprehensible input and more time to allow my students to practice speaking and writing and more time for inquiry into Francophone cultures. And then, second, is that I realized I could be increasing my level of differentiation way more than I am through use of Canvas. I could cultivate various resources and integrate different tools and apps to meet the needs of diverse learners. My more advanced students could be completing enrichment lessons, while I could help provide mediation to those who are struggling. Thank you again for watching my presentation on asynchronous virtual language instruction and its effects on student confidence and motivation. I hope you found it as interesting as it was for me to complete and that you gained something valuable. Merci.